What's going on, guys? We are back at it again with part 2 of Oversimplified's video on the American Revolution. If you guys recall on the previous video, I made it blatantly obvious that history is one of my go-to subjects, academically speaking. I love history. I took history classes in college a couple times. I really thoroughly enjoy history. More specifically, though, I like American history. So it wasn't much of a surprise to me to know that a lot of the stuff that was in the first part of the video, I had already known. But I did find it very refreshing to know that there was stuff that I was able to learn from the previous video. Not only that, but it was very refreshing in the sense that the method in which they showed or I guess gave information out to the audience was new and it felt great, comically speaking, and both in terms of information being portrayed to the audience. I thoroughly enjoyed the first video. It was so much fun to watch and especially so much fun to react to here on the channel. So lo and behold, this is part 2. If you guys recall in the previous video, I made it known that this was a 2-part series because their videos was a 2-part series. So this is part 2. As I did in the previous video, I'm going to leave a link in the description down below to the original video should you guys want to watch the original video on your own. Please do that after this video is done, though, because it really does help this channel grow. But if you guys want to support the original video, that option is down there for you guys as well. I'm excited for this video, guys. Similar to the last video, I'm not going to be surprised if I know the majority of the stuff in this video, but I'm always welcome to learn new information. And if I learn something great, amazing, it's what I'm looking to do here. But if I don't, as long as they make me laugh, it's still a good time for me. So let's see what happens. Before we do that, though, do me a huge favor, drop a like on this video. Also subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, because it really does help this channel grow. So with that being said, let's jump right into this. Part 2.
Washington's butt was sufficiently kicked.
Yes, it was.
Here. His troops' morale was low, some just up and left. Washington needed to do
Valley Forge.
anything to restore faith in the revolution. The British had spread throughout New Jersey and settled in for a winter of drinking cider and partying hard. Nobody expected an attack in the winter, so Washington started making plans for an attack
Delaware.
in the winter. The British had hired a large force of Hessian mercenaries from the German states of Hesse-Kassel and Hesse-Hanau to fight the rebels. It was these mercenaries that were stationed across the Delaware River from Washington and his army. And there were more Hessian reinforcements incoming, but they made an unscheduled stop because
I think it was on
thirsty. No, not that kind of thirsty. That kind of thirsty. It was Christmas Eve with a blizzard.
Yeah, Christmas Eve.
Washington heard the Hessian defenses were down, and he decided to attack. He made a perilous crossing of the icy Delaware River with 2,400 men and marched 9
That's a lot of men.
Where he caught the Hessian forces completely off guard. After a short but fierce battle, the Hessians surrendered in droves. It was a much-needed victory that sent a clear message, not only to the British, but to Americans across the colonies. The war was far from lost. General Cornwallis...
The crossing of the Delaware's one of the most significant moments in, I guess, the Revolutionary War. When people think of the Revolutionary War, people generally think of the obvious things like George Washington and the fact that we won and that's how we became a country, and the 4th of July, of course. But among all that stuff, in terms of the war itself, people for the most part remember the crossing of the Delaware, because that was a pretty significant moment in American history. At the time, people didn't typically battle on Christmas because it was tied into like religious practices and stuff like that. So the fact that the Americans, George Washington specifically, attacked on Christmas Eve, nobody was expecting an attack. So it was a very, I guess, simple victory for Washington because of the strategy that he imposed. It was pretty fascinating, to say the least.
Wallace led the British forces south to counterattack the Americans, but in a series of battles, Washington's defensive positioning and flanking maneuvers defeated the British 3 times in 10 days. And the British decided to abandon southern New Jersey for the rest of the winter. Washington finally set up a winter camp in Morristown, but for the Americans, there was much less partying than the British. Elsewhere, the British had taken Newport, Rhode Island, because it was a good naval base. In the south, they failed to take Charleston, South Carolina, which left British loyalists unsupported and vulnerable to more harassment and even mass expulsion.
No bullying.
Benjamin Franklin to France on a mission to convince them to join the war. And while the French generally loved any opportunity to hoodwink the Brits, they didn't want to join unless it was a sure win. So for now, Franklin spent his days chilling out and chasing tail. The British...
I actually didn't know that. I thought that when he went out there to get support from the French, I thought it was one of those situations where they were like, oh, you're fighting the British? Yeah, we'll hop on. I didn't know that it took some convincing, if you will. So that's interesting. I already learned something here in this video. So let's continue.
Parliament couldn't believe the war wasn't over yet, and the pressure was on to end it. So the British came up with a plan. General Burgoyne in Montreal and General William Howe in New York would advance through the Hudson Valley and meet in the middle, splitting the colonies in two, and thus screwing over the American communication lines. Burgoyne began his movement south, and after taking Fort Ticonderoga quite easily, he then came across heavy American resistance. So he sent Howe a dingle-dongle, asking if he'd be showing up anytime soon.
I think Howe went south
completely abandoned the plan
to Philadelphia.
Personal glory by capturing the American capital, Philadelphia. He defeated Washington and his army at Brandywine Creek by using the old hit him with a decoy and flank him from behind tactic, and Philadelphia was now in British hands, forcing Congress to escape to York. But Burgoyne was left on his own to face the ever-increasing American force.
And he lost.
American General Horatio Gates teamed up with our old friend Benedict Arnold to deal one final blow to Burgoyne's army.
Good old Benedict Arnold.
To take the fight to the British, but Gates wanted to wait for the British to come to them. After a heated debate, Gates, the senior officer, told Arnold to go to his room, but Arnold defied his orders, and at the Battle of Bemis Heights, he charged at the British and
destroyed them.
Great job, Horatio. By the way, what happened to that other guy who was in Saratoga? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him. Ouch.
You know, I'm not gonna lie. I kind of touched on this in the previous video, but I kind of understand where his reasoning was in terms of his betrayal. Benedict Arnold, he was never he was a man of, he was a very simple guy. He was up for like the glory and all this other stuff, but at the same time he wanted to be compensated fairly for everything that he did. At the time, the colonies didn't even have that much money to support a military, so a lot of the troops weren't getting paid. This included the generals and stuff like that. Case in point, Benedict Arnold. He wanted to get paid, but didn't get paid. On top of that, he wanted to be recognized for the stuff that he was doing. Never got recognized. So, of course, that ultimately left him to betray the Americans. And although I don't agree with the end result, the fact of the matter is, I guess I could understand his reasoning and why he betrayed the Americans. Pretty sad state of affairs, that is, especially because his new side later on, it wasn't until after he went to Philadelphia and met Peggy Shippen that he did all that stuff, but it's pretty crazy nonetheless. So let's just continue.
Hey George, didn't I do a great job? Taking Philadelphia and all? Didn't I? You're fired. Both Burgoyne and Howe returned to Great Britain, leaving British General Henry Clinton to take charge of the war. And the war was about to take a nasty turn, because with the victory at Saratoga, the French were finally ready to join the Americans.
Hey!
We're in. Hey, isn't this kind of funny? You know, because you're a republic trying to overthrow an absolute monarchy, and I'm an absolute monarchy helping you? Like, could you imagine if your revolution inspired my people to revolt against me?
That happened.
They imprisoned me and all my family?
They chopped his head off. Yep.
Could you imagine? That's called foreshadowing.
It is.
For now in America, winter was here once again, which meant yet more
10 years later, I think.
Starvation, and even a little mutiny. After losing Philadelphia, Washington's job was again on the line. But suddenly, a Prussian guy with a very fancy name, hired by Benjamin Franklin, showed up out of nowhere and said, "Hey, I'm here to give your men a European military training." And train them he did. They learned how to shoot accurately, how to march in formation, where to poop and where not to, and strict punishments were handed out to any who didn't comply. Washington's...
So... I touched up on this in the last video, but I can never remember his name for the life of me. I tried to remember in the previous video. No, it wasn't going to happen. I can never remember. Even now that I just saw his name, never going to remember his name. But he is arguably the reason why Americans came out a different entity from Valley Forge. Valley Forge was a very definitive moment in American history in terms of the American Revolution. Americans learned a lot that during that time at Valley Forge. That winter was a very harsh winter. At the same time, that individual, the Frenchman, came and rebooted our military from training to discipline, you name it. He gave us everything we needed to become a better military force. Not to mention the French Navy. Once they came and started offering help, the war was turning in our favor. And I still, till this day, argue that we probably would have never won the Revolutionary War had it not been for the French. So all you French people out there, thank you. We Americans appreciate it. All right, let's go.
army came out of the winter in 1778 a new and improved force, ready
Exactly.
to take Philadelphia back from the British. In the end, though, they didn't have to. With the French
It was
entry
empty.
into the war, the British ordered General Clinton to evacuate Philadelphia and consolidate all of the British forces in New York. So Washington sent Benedict Arnold to reoccupy and secure the city as he pursued the British through New Jersey on land, eventually finding a good opportunity to attack at Monmouth Courthouse. The battle took place...
Okay, really quick. They kind of jumped right over this, but that's a pretty significant moment for specifically Benedict Arnold being put in Philadelphia. So they got to Philadelphia and it was empty because it's like they said they went to New York to consolidate all their forces. But at Philadelphia is when he met Peggy Shippen, which, if I remember correctly, she was a spy for the British. And she had a very big role to play in terms of converting him over to, I guess, turncoat, right? And, yeah, so Peggy was a very significant figure for not just the American Revolution, but specifically Benedict Arnold in his, I guess, route to betray the Americans. So, yeah.
On a sweltering hot summer's day, and as many soldiers died from heat stroke as they did from battle. In the end, after some borderline treason from Washington's second in command, it was a draw. And in this war, a draw is kind of a victory for the Americans. Next up, let's talk about this guy. This is John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones is handsome,
the pirate,
and absolutely insane. When the war first broke out, everyone was like, how did the colonies expect to stand up to the might of the British Navy with their meager fleet of converted merchantmen? Yep, try telling that to John Paul Jones. This guy sailed to the British Isles, somehow captured a British ship off the coast of Ireland, and brought it back to France. Then he returned, attacking more ships, raiding towns, and evading capture the entire time. These are basically pirate tactics. But hey, if it works, it works.
Oh, I thought he was a pirate.
He captured a British ship and returned to a Dutch port without an official ensign because his was lost during the battle. That's a big no-no and can have you arrested as a pirate. The Dutch helped him out by quickly creating a design based on Benjamin Franklin's description of what the American flag should look like, and they entered it into their records as an official U.S. flag. What
That's cool.
Looks pretty cool. The whole campaign probably played heavily on British morale and brought into question their ability to win the war. And fun fact, he was so cool that one of the towns he raided in 1778 gave him an official honorary pardon in 1999. Keep ripping in heaven, John Paul Jones. You're an angel now. What the Continental Navy was lacking in resources, though, the French entry into the war made up for. The French began with naval skirmishes in the English Channel, and they sent a large fleet to America, although it sustained a lot of damage in a storm off Rhode Island. The Americans
didn't know that either.
A bigger commitment from the French, so John Adams went to France to help Benjamin Franklin continue negotiations. Oh good, you're finally here. Check this out. Hey ladies, I'd like to fly you like a kite, because you're electrifying. Isn't this great? Is this what you've been doing? Yeah, why? We were sent here on a diplomatic mission to secure military support from France, not to philander with the locals. Wait, no, ladies, come back. Worst wingman ever. But the Americans would get some more help. The Dutch provided aid, although they never formed an official alliance.
I didn't know that.
More significantly, though, the Spanish,
I did know that.
providing aid, officially joined the war in June 1779. They would provide support in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, campaigns that heavily impacted the Native American tribes in those areas. Both sides actually enlisted the help of Native American tribes throughout the war.
That's
sometimes
true.
Even pitting those tribes against each other. In the summer of 1779, after a series of raids against the Americans by the Iroquois, Washington organized an expedition that burned down more than 40 villages, forcing the tribes to relocate to Canada for British protection. And another group that shouldn't go unmentioned, the African Americans, both free and enslaved. They joined both sides of the war, hoping to gain their freedom. But afterwards, many were simply returned to slavery, particularly those who had fought for the Americans.
So the Civil War was one of those moments in history that's very shameful for Americans. For everyone who's not American watching this video, it's one of those situations, a lot of people don't realize this, but we Americans consider that a very shameful moment in our history. And we acknowledge the fact that it happened. We love the history behind it, but not the acts that took place, of course, but the historical context behind it. And knowing the history behind it allows us to not repeat the mistakes that we did in the past, right? So it's a lot of Americans consider the actions of slavery and stuff in America as one of the most shameful moments in American history. So to include myself, I think it's sad. I really, really do. But yeah, let's go ahead and continue.
Despite owning slaves himself, Jefferson had written a condemnation of slavery in the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, that's true. They took it out, though.
Out of fear of offending the southern colonies, this was removed from the final draft. For the same reason, the American Army stopped enlisting African American men in 1775, a policy that Washington, a slave owner himself, supported, but they were forced to reverse the policy after the British promised freedom to any slaves who joined them. In general, you stood a better chance of gaining freedom if you fought for the British. However, even those that left with the British after the war suffered mistreatment and discrimination in their new lives outside of America. Our good friend Benedict Arnold is now in charge of Philadelphia, having a good time, partying down with, and even marrying a member of the Philadelphia elite, the same elite that had partied down with the British when they controlled the city. And suddenly, the people of Philadelphia, including the state governor, started accusing Arnold of having pro-British sentiments. To keep the people happy, Washington wrote a letter rebuking Arnold, calling his conduct imprudent and improper, and that was too many ouchies for Benedict Arnold to handle. He asked Washington to put him in charge of the fort at West Point. Then he contacted the British, offering to hand the plans of the fort over to them and join their side. Our good friend Benedict Arnold is our good friend
Turncoat.
No more. Luckily, the treasonous plans were discovered on a captured British officer, but Arnold managed to escape before he was arrested. As a British general, he would go on to lead raids.
The British officer, they ended up hanging him as an example. I can't remember his name, but he was a very handsome young man, and I think he liked art and all this other stuff. Like, he was a very intelligent and smart person. I think he was the head of intelligence. Actually, I can't remember. I might have watched that from somewhere else. I don't really remember, but yeah, he was they hanged him for treason.
Raids against American cities, most notably his raid of Richmond, Virginia in 1781. His betrayal shook George Washington, who had once again set up camp at Morristown. His leadership somehow held the Continental Army together through the harshest winter of the war.
So a lot of people don't know this, but when people think of like George Washington, they think of the heroics that he did, the fact that he won us the Revolutionary War, and all that stuff, right? The heroism, the modesty, or even the fact that he was the first president. But people don't remember the fact that the betrayal by Benedict Arnold, alongside with a lot of other reasons, it hit him hard. The betrayal specifically hit him really, really hard. He was actually borderline very depressed. But still, even with all of his hardships, he still kept the military together because he was very, I guess, inspiring. He was a very good leader in the sense that he was very capable of keeping everybody together. But even though, in my personal opinion, he probably wasn't the greatest military tactician, the fact still remains he was a very great leader in general. So let's go ahead and continue.
During 1780, and Parliament was hopping mad that the war still wasn't over. The British debt was soaring, and despite taking parts of Massachusetts in late 1779, the North was in a stalemate, so the British decided to make a major shift in strategy to the South, an economically rich area with a higher level of support for the British, or so the British thought. A year earlier, they had captured the under-defended city of Savannah, Georgia easily, and a joint American-French counter-siege failed. Now, they laid siege to Charleston, South Carolina. It fell within months, with thousands of American troops surrendering to the British, a costly defeat.
Very, very bad.
They quickly moved to take control, and they sent stereotypical Hollywood villain with a British accent, Bannister the Butcher.
I forgot about Tarleton.
He hunted down rebels and
the Butcher
with ruthless brutality. The British presence also inspired local loyalist militias in the backcountry to rise up against their persecutors. The British.
I do think that General Cornwallis was worse, because although Tarleton was very brutal towards other people, like colonists and colonist sympathizers, etc., etc., Cornwallis also didn't. He was kind of like that. Even though he wanted to be seen as a gentleman, but he also didn't care about his own people. As a matter of fact, there was multiple times where he fired on his own people throughout the war, which is crazy. So I don't know. I guess it's like give or take who's worse, but I personally think Cornwallis was worse.
The British really seemed to be onto something with their new strategy, and the ball was very much in Washington's court. I'm going to send my most loyal general, Nathaniel Greene, to the south to stop the British.
Mr. Nathaniel Greene.
We're sending hero of Saratoga and your biggest rival, Horatio Gates. Watch this, George.
He's a
I'm
weenie.
Gonna save the day again. Everybody will love me, and I'm going to get your job. Here I go. And he got into one battle with Cornwallis, got annihilated, and ran away. Alrighty, let's go with your guy. Nathaniel Greene knew the British outnumbered his own forces and wouldn't be defeated with conventional tactics, so he had to think outside the box. He split his army.
Oh, this was genius, by the way.
Look at me. And then they went running in two different directions. Cornwallis sent Tarleton after Morgan, and he caught up with him at Cowpens, where Morgan proceeded to kick Tarleton's butt. Then the two led Cornwallis on a wild chase through North Carolina. His bigger and better equipped army, much heavier and...
The Americans were more mobile and agile, so they were able to get them exhausted easily.
slower than Greene's quick and mobile troops.
Exactly.
Green led Cornwallis further and further from his supply line, then crossed the Dan River into Virginia, picked up some reinforcements, and
turned
back
around.
to face the now exhausted British. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, the two sides engaged in vicious close combat. Cornwallis, fearing loss, fired his big guns into the chaotic fighting, cutting down many of his own men. Greene retreated, giving Cornwallis the victory, but Cornwallis lost a quarter of his men in the fighting, so it felt much more like a British defeat. At this point, both sides desperately needed...
That's exactly what I was talking about. Cornwallis was notorious at firing at his own men. And, I mean, would he have lost 550 people in that battle? Probably not, if it wasn't for him firing on his own men. You know? He's very barbaric in that sense.
Something to happen soon to end the fighting. The British were running out of money, while the Americans were again facing mutinies as the men went without pay or even basic living needs. Fortunately, the French were now showing up in greater numbers and were ready to fight. After his encounter with Greene, Cornwallis decided the only way to win the South was to first prevent the Southern Continental Army from using Virginia as a supply base. So he abandoned the Carolinas, moving to Wilmington and on to Yorktown, a position the British believed would be easy to supply and support. On his march to Yorktown, he raided many farms, stealing horses and supplies from the locals, but also freeing thousands of slaves, many of whom joined him. The French saw Cornwallis's new position as an opportunity to land a decisive blow on the British. Washington wanted to attack Clinton in New York, but the French said it was a really dumb idea. And to be fair, it was. Instead, Washington sent out fake dispatches to make it look like they would attack Clinton, but secretly their combined force marched all the way down to Virginia. A large French fleet under the command of Comte de Grasse arrived and successfully
destroyed their navy
out of the Chesapeake Bay. The combined land and naval forces then laid siege to Cornwallis's army in Yorktown. The American and French forces tightened in around the city.
This is the finale.
Cornwallis, who desperately appealed to Clinton for aid, but Clinton was unusually chilled out about the whole thing. Cornwallis held out for nearly a month before he had no choice but to surrender. Over 7,000 British troops were captured, a crushing defeat. And with that, Parliament had reached the end of its rope. The war just wasn't worth it, and it needed to end now.
Really quick. So, when Cornwallis fell, he was so prideful that he wouldn't even surrender to the Americans. He basically gave, I think, one of his generals his sword to give to the American side, signifying his defeat and his surrender. But he couldn't do it in person. I think historically speaking, he said that he was sick or something. But regardless, it was very, I guess you could say weenie-ish of him, for lack of better words. So, yeah. There you go, Mr. Cornwallis.
British still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but fighting between the two sides mostly ceased as peace negotiations opened up in Paris. The resulting treaty in 1783 saw Great Britain remove its troops from American soil, recognize U.S. independence, and cede territory up to the Mississippi River. In return, the Americans agreed to pay any debt still owed to Britain and gave fair treatment to any colonists who had remained loyal to the crown. The Spanish got Florida, while the French got an economic crisis that led to its own revolution a decade later. Washington retired to his home in Mount Vernon, wishing his men farewell by saying, "I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." He hoped to live out the rest of his days in peace, but unfortunately for him, a number of people wanted him to be the first leader of the new country, and by a number
unanimous,
of people, I mean literally everyone. The first election campaign in American history was basically a grassroots effort to convince Washington to accept the office.
The interesting thing behind that is, I think he was the only president to ever win unanimously the presidential seat, right? Or the presidential office. But even more miraculously, it was the fact that he did it again 4 years later. And furthermore, it was his willful, I guess, act of giving up the presidency that created a tradition in American history where every 8 years, if you get 2 terms, every 8 years, you, if you're the president, you willfully relinquish your power to the next incoming president, which is pretty remarkable, I think.
Sworn in on April 30th, 1789, and he himself established many of the standards and limitations of what the American leader should be. First of all, there was debate on what he should be called. Is he a king? Is he our glorious leader? In the end, they went for a word that at the time was pretty modest. President, like the president of your local bowling club or office bake sale committee. He set up a cabinet of expert advisors, knowing that no president could know everything, no matter how much of a stable genius they claimed to be. He proposed major legislation to Congress and gave an annual State of the Union address to keep his own power in check. He stated that the U.S. should remain neutral in foreign conflicts, and in the end, he voluntarily gave up his power after just 2 terms. He could have made the presidency anything he wanted, but his careful and cautious actions helped set the precedent of an office that is powerful in its limitations, decisive through its diplomacy, and respected in its humility. And so the United States was born, and everything was perfect. It had no problems, not a single one.
Nope, none at all.
I don't know, caused such an extreme divide that it would lead to a civil war.
Nope, never happened. So that was the end of that video. Guys, so just like in the first video, I knew a very significant portion of this, the information portrayed here. However, I think I learned more things on this video than I did in the previous video. But I just want to say that the way that Oversimplified tells their teaches historical events is done in a very, I guess, excellent way. It's done very, very well. How they mix history with a nice humor and stuff like that is just done so excellent, right? But sometimes the only problem, I guess, that I complaint or criticism that I can put is the fact that sometimes when you put too many modern jokes on a historical context from a long time ago, it kind of creates this doubt. I guess you could say it's like, what? Did that actually happen, or was that just a joke type of situation, you know? But overall, though, these videos are done so well. I love them. I have fun watching these videos, reacting to them, of course, on the channel. So if you guys want me to react to any other videos, do me a favor, let me know down in the comment section down below, because I will definitely check them out if that's something you guys would like to see. So with that being said, if you guys enjoyed this video, do me a huge favor, drop a like on this video. Also subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, because it really does help this channel grow. So with that being said, catch you guys in the next one. Deuces.